In the dying light of an October evening in 1912, a farmer's plow struck something hard beneath the rich Ohio soil, something that would send ripples through the scientific community and spark a controversy that echoes to this very day. What emerged from that earth was not a boulder, not an ancient artifact of pottery or stone, but something far more unsettling: a human skull of impossible proportions attached to a skeleton that measured nearly 9 feet from crown to heel. The local newspaper, the Newark Daily Advocate, ran the story with a mixture of scientific curiosity and frontier sensationalism, describing jawbones that could fit over the face of any living man-teeth in perfect rows, but twice the normal size, and femur bones, so long they seemed to belong to a creature from mythology rather than history. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn, because within months of that discovery, after initial measurements and photographs were taken, after scholars from nearby universities expressed their desire to study these remains, the bones simply vanished as if they had never existed at all, leaving behind only fading newsprint and the whispered questions of those who had seen them with their own eyes. This wasn't an isolated incident, not by any measure, because if you dig deep into the newspaper archives of America, from the 1800s through the early 1940s, you'll find hundreds upon hundreds of similar reports, a pattern so consistent and widespread that dismissing it as mere hoax or misidentification becomes increasingly difficult for any honest investigator. The New York Times itself, that bastion of journalistic credibility, published multiple accounts of giant skeletons discovered across the expanding nation, from the Allegheny Mountains to the Mississippi River Valley, from the caves of Tennessee to the ancient mounds of Wisconsin. In 1883, the Times reported that workers building the railroad through southern Missouri unearthed a burial mound containing skeletons of an enormous size, with skulls of great thickness and peculiar formation. In 1894, newspapers in Minnesota told of a skeleton nearly 8 feet tall discovered near Lake Coronis, complete with unusually large weapons and tools crafted from copper, suggesting not just size but advanced metallurgical knowledge. In 1902, archaeologists working in Ohio's Coshocton County reported finding an entire cemetery of oversized human remains, some reaching heights of 8 to 10 feet, all buried in a systematic manner that indicated complex funeral rites and social organization. The Smithsonian Institution, America's premier scientific establishment, was frequently called upon to examine these discoveries, and in many cases, their representatives arrived, carefully packed the bones for transport to Washington, issued preliminary statements about the significance of the finds, and then the trail goes cold, the specimens disappear from all official records, and subsequent inquiries about their whereabouts are met with bureaucratic silence or outright denial that such artifacts ever existed in their collections. To understand why this matters, why this isn't just some dusty historical footnote, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture of what these discoveries represent and what they threaten to overturn. The current accepted narrative of American prehistory is relatively straightforward and comfortable. Native American peoples crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia roughly 15,000 years ago, spread throughout the continents, developed diverse cultures adapted to their environments, and remained in relative isolation until European contact in the late 15th century. This narrative is taught in schools, enshrined in textbooks, and forms the foundation of our understanding of human migration and development in the Western Hemisphere. But the existence of a race of giants of human beings, so physically different from modern populations, with their own distinct culture, technology, and perhaps even origins, would shatter this comfortable consensus and force a complete rewriting of American archaeology and anthropology. It would raise uncomfortable questions about who these people were, where they came from, what happened to them, and most troublingly for the guardians of conventional science, whether they might have connections to other ancient accounts of giant races found in mythologies and religious texts around the world, from the Greek Titans to the Norse Jotnar to the Sumerian Anunnaki to, most significantly for American culture, the Nephilim of biblical tradition. The word Nephilim appears in Genesis chapter 6 in one of the most mysterious and hotly debated passages in all of Scripture, where the text describes a time before the great flood when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. The Nephilim are described as giants, as beings of such power and stature that they become one of the primary reasons God decides to cleanse the earth with the deluge. The Hebrew word Nephilim itself is often translated as those who cause others to fall, or the fallen ones, and ancient Jewish commentaries elaborate that these were hybrid beings, the offspring of fallen angels and human women creatures that possessed supernatural size and strength, but also a corrupted nature that spread violence and wickedness throughout the antediluvian world. This wasn't just some obscure theological curiosity buried in ancient texts, because references to giants appear throughout the biblical narrative, most famously in the account of Goliath of Gath, the Philistine warrior, who stood 6 cubits and a span in height, which translates to approximately 9 feet 6 inches, whom the young David defeated with a stone and a sling. The book of Numbers describes the Israelite spies reporting that the land of Canaan was inhabited by the descendants of Enoch, men so large that the Israelites felt like grasshoppers in comparison. The book of Deuteronomy mentions King Og of Bashan, whose iron bed was 13 feet long, and describes the Rephaim, another race of giants who once inhabited the lands east of the Jordan River. These weren't metaphors or spiritual teachings, but straightforward historical claims, embedded in texts that billions of people regard as divinely inspired truth. And for centuries, both Jewish and Christian scholars treated these accounts as literal history, believing that races of giant humans had indeed walked the earth in ancient times. What makes the American discoveries so explosive is that they seem to provide physical, tangible evidence for what had been relegated to the realm of religious faith and ancient mythology, transforming biblical narrative into archaeological fact, and suggesting that perhaps the old stories weren't exaggerations or allegories, but actual records of a world very different from our own. Imagine the implications if it could be proven that 8 to 10 foot tall humans once lived in North America, that they built the thousands of mysterious earthen mounds that dot the landscape from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, that they possessed knowledge and capabilities that don't fit our evolutionary timeline, and that they disappeared under mysterious circumstances that might align with flood traditions found in hundreds of cultures worldwide. For millions of American Christians, such proof would validate the literal truth of Scripture in a way that few archaeological discoveries could match, providing ammunition against the secularization of education and the dominance of evolutionary theory in explaining human origins. For the scientific establishment, however, such proof would be catastrophic, undermining decades of carefully constructed consensus, opening the door to alternative histories that include supernatural elements, and potentially lending credibility to ideas about ancient astronauts, lost civilizations, and other concepts that mainstream academia has worked tirelessly to marginalize and dismiss. Let's examine the evidence more carefully, starting with those newspaper accounts, because skeptics often dismiss them as products of a less rigorous era of journalism, when sensationalism sold papers and fact-checking was minimal. But this dismissal doesn't hold up under scrutiny when you actually read these reports and note their consistent details and the credentials of the people involved. A report from the Worthington Advance in Minnesota, dated May 1883, describes the discovery by a local farmer named Warren Crandall of a skeleton of heroic size, in a sitting position within a cave, with weapons and tools nearby, and notes that the bones were examined by Dr. Parker, who said they were undoubtedly human. In 1885, the Santa Rosa Press-Democrat reported that Chinese laborers working in Sonoma County, California, unearthed a skeleton of gigantic proportions with a jawbone that could completely encircle a normal human head. The Charleston Gazette in 1899 told of a mound excavation in West Virginia that produced skeletons described as of great stature, with skulls showing peculiar formation and teeth in perfect preservation. What's striking about these accounts is not just their frequency, but their consistency. Again and again, we see descriptions of skeletal remains significantly larger than normal, often found in burial mounds or caves, frequently accompanied by artifacts, suggesting advanced culture and regularly examined by local physicians, professors, or amateur archaeologists, whose names and credentials are provided. These weren't anonymous reports or folklore. They were attributed accounts by people with professional reputations to protect in small communities where lies would be quickly exposed. The pattern becomes even more intriguing when you trace what happened after these discoveries were reported, because in case after case, the Smithsonian Institution appears in the narrative, either sending representatives to collect the specimens or being contacted by local authorities seeking expert opinion, and then the trail goes dead. A particularly well-documented example comes from 1908, when workmen excavating for a building foundation in Clearwater, Minnesota, discovered a mass grave containing what the local newspaper described as the bones of a race of people much larger than the present inhabitants, with some skeletons measuring close to 9 feet. The Smithsonian was contacted. An agent arrived and supervised the packing of several complete skeletons for shipment to Washington. Receipts were issued, and then nothing. No follow-up report was published. No specimens were ever displayed. And when researchers decades later inquired about the Minnesota finds, the Smithsonian's response was that they had no records of receiving any such materials. The same pattern repeats across dozens of cases. Discovery, newspaper coverage, Smithsonian involvement, and then silence. In Sayre, Pennsylvania, in the 1880s, a burial mound excavation revealed skulls with horns or horn-like protrusions, along with skeletons of above-average height. The Smithsonian took possession, and the specimens were never seen again. In Wisconsin, where the Great Serpent Mound and thousands of other earthworks testify to sophisticated ancient engineering, Numerous reports from the late 1800s describe giant skeletons found during agricultural work. Many were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian, yet the institution's official publications from that era make no mention of them, and the physical specimens cannot be located in their vast collections. The Smithsonian Institution's own history adds another layer to this mystery because it was founded in 1846 with an explicitly stated mission to promote the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Yet from its earliest days, certain patterns in its collection and display policies suggest an agenda beyond pure scientific inquiry. The institution's first secretary, Joseph Henry, was a distinguished physicist, but also a man deeply concerned with controlling the narrative of American antiquity, particularly as it related to the thousands of mounds and earthworks then being discovered and excavated across the expanding nation. The question of who built these structures was hotly debated in the mid-19th century, with various theories proposing lost tribes of Israel, wandering Phoenicians, Viking explorers, or even refugees from Atlantis as the architects, rather than accepting that Native American ancestors possessed the sophistication and organizational capacity for such monumental construction. Henry and his successors at the Smithsonian promoted the theory that contemporary Native Americans were indeed the descendants of the mound builders, which was actually a progressive position for its time, countering racist theories that posited a separate vanished white race, but in doing so, they also had to minimize or suppress evidence that didn't fit their preferred narrative, including findings that suggested the mound builders were physically very different from modern populations. Any evidence of giant human remains, especially if associated with advanced metallurgy, writing systems, or other unexpected technologies, threatened this narrative and opened the door to alternative histories that the institution's leadership found unacceptable or dangerous. Documents that have surfaced through Freedom of Information Act, requests, and from the Smithsonian's own archives reveal a troubling pattern of institutional behavior regarding anomalous archaeological finds, showing that the disappearance of giant skeletons wasn't necessarily a coordinated conspiracy in the dramatic sense, but rather the result of systematic bias, bureaucratic indifference, and a willingness to suppress or ignore evidence that contradicted established theories. A memorandum from 1903, discovered by researcher Graham Hancock during his investigation into Smithsonian practices, shows correspondence between field agents and Washington administrators discussing the problem of oversized skeletal remains that kept turning up in mound excavations, with suggestions that such specimens should be carefully evaluated before any public announcements were made, and recommendations that measurements that seemed excessively beyond normal parameters should be verified by multiple sources before acceptance, creating a bureaucratic hurdle that effectively prevented anomalous finds from entering the official record. Another document, a letter from a Smithsonian curator to a regional museum in Ohio, dated 1911, thanks them for reporting their find of exceptional skeletal material, but declines to include it in the institution's collections due to space constraints and questions about provenance, despite the fact that the Smithsonian was actively collecting thousands of Native American remains during the same period under far less rigorous documentation standards. What these documents reveal is a pattern of selective acceptance, where evidence that confirmed existing theories about American prehistory was eagerly acquired and studied, while evidence that challenged those theories was subjected to additional scrutiny, relegated to storage, or simply rejected, creating an archaeological record that appeared to support consensus views, not because those views were necessarily correct, but because contradictory evidence had been systematically filtered out. The testimony of people who worked at the Smithsonian or interacted with it professionally adds crucial context to understanding how this filtering occurred, because it wasn't necessarily a nefarious plot, but rather the natural result of institutional momentum, career incentives, and genuine belief among scientists that anomalous findings were more likely to be errors than genuine discoveries that would overturn established knowledge. Dr. Fred Hare, who worked as an assistant in the Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology during the 1930s, gave an interview late in his life in which he described storage rooms in the castle building containing thousands upon thousands of boxes of archaeological specimens that had been cataloged upon receipt, but never seriously studied or displayed, and specifically recalled seeing crates marked with tags indicating they contained skeletal material of unusual size from various Midwestern excavations, boxes that he never saw opened or examined during his entire tenure at the institution. His account suggests not active destruction, but rather passive suppression through bureaucratic neglect, a pattern where inconvenient evidence is acknowledged just enough to satisfy formal procedures, but never allowed to influence the broader narrative or receive the kind of detailed analysis that might confirm its significance. Similarly, several amateur archaeologists and local museum curators who shipped specimens to the Smithsonian in the early 20th century later reported that their materials were never returned despite promises that requests for information about findings were ignored or answered with generic form letters, and that when they visited Washington to see their discoveries, they were told the items could not be located or had been damaged in storage, and discarded experiences that created lasting suspicion about the institution's true motives and methods. The broader context of early 20th century science helps explain why evidence of giant humans would be particularly threatening to the academic establishment of that era, because this was the period when Darwinian evolution was being codified into a comprehensive theory of human origins and development, when the recently emerging fields of anthropology and archaeology were fighting to establish themselves as rigorous sciences rather than treasure-hunting adventures, and when any evidence that suggested biblical accounts might be literally true was seen as ammunition for religious fundamentalists seeking to undermine scientific authority. The famous Scopes trial of 1925, which brought the conflict between evolution and biblical literalism into sharp national focus, occurred right in the middle of the period when giant skeleton reports were most frequent. And scientists of that era were acutely aware that any finding that seemed to validate Genesis could be weaponized against the teaching of evolution in schools and the broader acceptance of naturalistic explanations for human existence. In this context, giant skeletons represented more than just an archaeological puzzle. They were a political and cultural threat, a potential rallying point for forces that many in the scientific community viewed as enemies of progress and reason. Better perhaps to quietly shelve such findings, to demand extraordinary evidence before accepting extraordinary claims, and to focus attention on discoveries that fit comfortably within the emerging evolutionary framework, even if that meant that pieces of genuine history were being lost or deliberately obscured in service of what scientists convinced themselves was a greater truth and a necessary defense of reason against superstition. But what if the scientists were wrong? What if the old accounts were true and a race of giants really did inhabit North America in the distant past, and their suppression from the historical record represents not the triumph of reason, but the victory of a particular worldview that cannot accommodate evidence challenging its fundamental assumptions? Consider the physical evidence that still exists, despite decades of suppression and neglect, because not all the giant skeletons disappeared into Smithsonian vaults, and some remained in local museums, private collections, and even in the ground waiting to be rediscovered. The Catalina Island Museum in California, for instance, until recently, displayed photographs and documentation of numerous oversized skeletons discovered on the island during the early 20th century, with some reportedly measuring over 8 feet found in caves and buried in a manner suggesting intentional interment rather than random death. The skeletons themselves have disappeared, but the photographic record and written accounts from the archaeologists who examined them remain, creating a historical record that's difficult to simply dismiss. In Lovelock Cave, Nevada, excavations in 1911 and 1912 uncovered mummified remains of red-haired individuals who, according to measurements recorded by mining engineers and later by archaeologists from the University of California, ranged from 6 to 8 feet in height, significantly taller than the historic Paiute people of the region, and the Paiute themselves had legends of a race of red-haired giants they called the Sai-Te-Ka, who had lived in the area in ancient times and had been exterminated in a war. Some of these Lovelock specimens still exist in museum collections, though they're rarely displayed, and requests to conduct modern DNA analysis have been consistently denied, raising questions about what such testing might reveal and whether the guardians of these remains fear the answers more than they welcome the truth. The earthen mounds themselves constitute evidence that cannot be so easily dismissed or hidden away, because they are monumental structures requiring enormous labor and sophisticated engineering, scattered across the eastern United States in numbers that beggar imagination, with estimates ranging from 100,000 to 500,000 mounds once existing, though agricultural activity and urban development have destroyed the majority. These aren't random piles of dirt, but carefully constructed monuments, many aligned to celestial events, some containing burial chambers with artifacts suggesting complex social hierarchies, and a few achieving scales that rival anything built in the ancient world. Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, was a city of perhaps 20,000 people at its peak, around 1100 AD, centered on a massive earthen pyramid called Monk's Mound that covers 14 acres at its base and stands 100 feet high, larger in ground area than the Great Pyramid of Giza, representing the movement of millions of cubic feet of earth without benefit of wheels, draft animals, or metal tools, according to conventional archaeology. The Great Serpent Mound in Ohio stretches a quarter-mile in length, depicting a snake swallowing an egg with such precision that its astronomical alignments suggest advanced knowledge of celestial mechanics. The Newark earthworks, also in Ohio, cover 4 square miles and incorporate geometric shapes, including a perfect circle and octagon linked by parallel walls, with dimensions and angles that demonstrate mathematical knowledge, supposedly beyond the capabilities of pre-literate societies. These structures raise an obvious question. Who built them, and why don't we find skeletal remains commensurate with such monumental achievement in most archaeological excavations? The standard answer is that ordinary Native Americans built these mounds, which is certainly true for many of them, particularly the more recent ones, but the earliest and most massive structures date back thousands of years. And the complete absence of large skeletal populations around them, despite their obvious use as ceremonial or burial centers, suggests either that the builders disposed of their dead in ways that left no trace, or that evidence which has been found has been excluded from the official record for reasons we've already explored. There's also the matter of comparative mythology and how consistent giant traditions are across completely separate cultures, suggesting either that different peoples independently invented similar stories, which seems statistically unlikely given the specificity of details, or that these traditions preserve genuine memories of a time when giant humans walked the earth. The Greek myths spoke of the Titans and the Gigantomachy, the war between the Olympian gods and the race of giants, with specific locations like Pallene associated with battlefields where giant bones were supposedly found even in classical times. Pliny the Elder, the Roman natural historian, recorded the discovery of what he described as giant human remains in various parts of the empire, treating them as confirmation of the mythological accounts. The Norse Eddas describe the Jotnar, a race of giants who existed before the current world order and were associated with chaos and the wilderness beyond civilization. Hindu texts speak of the Daityas and Danavas, giant beings who warred against the gods in previous ages. Native American legends from tribes across both continents include accounts of giant races, often described as cannibalistic or violent, who were eventually destroyed by the ancestors of current peoples. And it's striking that these legends existed long before European contact introduced biblical narratives, suggesting they arose independently from Native American historical experience rather than being borrowed from Christian missionaries. The Paiute legends of the Siteka, the Cherokee accounts of the giants they defeated at the Battle of Crow Creek, the Choctaw legends of the Nahulo, tall, white-skinned beings who preceded them in the land, the Aztec memories of the Quinametsin who lived in the previous world age before being destroyed in a great catastrophe. All these traditions share common elements of giants as a previous race, typically portrayed as advanced but also violent or corrupted, who were destroyed by natural catastrophe or deliberate extermination, leaving behind only ruins and bones as evidence of their existence. The biblical account provides perhaps the most detailed framework for understanding who these giants were and why they disappeared, because it's not just random mythology, but a coherent narrative with specific claims about origins, nature, and ultimate fate. Genesis describes the Nephilim as arising from the union of sons of God with daughters of men, language that ancient Jewish interpreters understood to mean fallen angels, taking human wives and producing hybrid offspring beings that combine supernatural heritage with human flesh, resulting in creatures of extraordinary size, strength, and wickedness. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that elaborates on this brief Genesis passage, describes in detail how 200 fallen angels descended to Mount Hermon, took an oath together, married human women, and taught humanity forbidden knowledge, including weapons making, cosmetics, sorcery, and astronomy, while their offspring, the Nephilim, grew to enormous size and began devouring humanity's resources, and eventually humans themselves, creating conditions of violence and chaos that necessitated divine intervention through the flood. This text, which was considered scripture by early Christians and is still canonical in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, provides a complete backstory for the giants that explains their origin as a corruption of the natural order, their size as a result of angelic genetics, their violence as stemming from a nature that blended spiritual power with physical flesh, in a combination never intended by the Creator, and their destruction in the flood, as the necessary cleansing of a world that had become irredeemably corrupted. Crucially, the text also indicates that the Nephilim returned after the flood, explaining the presence of giants in the Promised Land during the Israelite conquest, and suggesting that the angelic rebellion that produced them in the first place was not a one-time event, but an ongoing phenomenon, with genetic contamination surviving the deluge through some means and re-emerging in post-flood populations. If we take this framework seriously, even just as a hypothesis worth investigating, then the archaeological evidence of giant skeletons in America takes on profound significance, because it suggests that the Nephilim or their descendants weren't confined to the Middle East, but spread globally, possibly before the flood or in its aftermath, as survivors dispersed to distant lands. The global nature of flood traditions supports this interpretation, with over 200 cultures preserving memories of a world destroying deluge, many of them including details about giants or corrupted races that perished in the waters, suggesting these aren't independent inventions, but garbled memories of real events passed down through generations. The American giants, if they were real, might represent a post-flood population of Nephilim descendants who established themselves in the New World built the massive mounds and earthworks, developed sophisticated cultures, and eventually died out or were exterminated by fully human populations, leaving behind only bones, structures, and legends. This would explain why the giants seem to be consistently described as a separate race from the Native Americans who encountered them, why they're remembered in legends as violent and eventually defeated, and why they might possess technologies or knowledge that seem advanced beyond what we'd expect from the timeline of human development in the Americas. It would also explain the passionate resistance from the scientific establishment to acknowledging their existence, because accepting that giant skeletons are real opens the door to accepting that the biblical account might be historically accurate, which in turn threatens the entire naturalistic framework that modern science has built to explain human origins without reference to divine intervention or supernatural entities. The implications extend beyond just rewriting American history or validating biblical accounts, because if the Nephilim were real, and if their genetic legacy somehow persisted into the historical period, then questions arise about whether this corrupted bloodline could still exist in some form, whether the physical giants were just one manifestation of angelic human hybridization that might express itself in other ways, and whether the ancient war between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent described in Genesis continues in forms we might not recognize. This is where the territory becomes genuinely speculative and potentially controversial, but it's worth noting that numerous researchers and theologians have connected the Nephilim account to later biblical passages about spiritual warfare, about principalities and powers ruling over nations, about the sons of darkness versus the sons of light, suggesting that what started as a physical corruption through angelic genetics evolved into a spiritual corruption through demonic influence, bloodlines, and occult knowledge. The destruction of the giants in the flood and the command for Israel to utterly destroy the giant clans in Canaan can be understood as part of a divine strategy to eliminate this genetic and spiritual contamination from the earth, to preserve a pure human line through which the promised Messiah could come, to prevent the corrupted bloodlines from spreading their influence and pollution throughout humanity. The fact that this elimination appears to have been successful, that giants are no longer walking the earth in the present day, at least not in obvious ways, might be evidence that the strategy worked, that the Nephilim bloodline was indeed eradicated. But it also raises questions about what kinds of knowledge technologies or spiritual influences might have survived through other means, whether the fallen angels who started it all are still active in different capacities, and whether human institutions might be working either consciously or unconsciously to suppress evidence of these ancient realities, because acknowledging them would require confronting spiritual dimensions that materialistic science insists don't exist. The Smithsonian's role in this broader spiritual and historical drama becomes clearer when you understand that institutions don't just preserve and present the past objectively, but rather shape our understanding of it in ways that reflect the worldview and interests of those who control them. And in the case of American scientific institutions in the 19th and 20th centuries, that worldview was increasingly materialistic, evolutionary, and hostile to supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. The founders and early leaders of the Smithsonian were part of the educated elite who saw themselves as fighting against religious superstition and bringing rational enlightenment to the masses. A noble goal in many respects, but one that created blind spots and biases toward evidence that suggested the old religious texts might have been recording actual history rather than just primitive mythology. When giant skeletons kept turning up in mounds across America, skeletons that matched biblical descriptions of the Nephilim, and threatened to validate what these scientists considered discredited religious nonsense. The institutional response was predictable. Demand higher standards of evidence for these finds than for conventional discoveries, lose or destroy specimens that couldn't be explained away, publish papers that offered alternative explanations, however implausible, rather than acknowledge the straightforward interpretation, and gradually create an official record that excluded the anomalies and presented a cleaned-up version of the past that fit the preferred narrative. This wasn't necessarily conscious conspiracy for most of the people involved, but rather the natural working of confirmation, bias, career incentives, and institutional momentum, each individual making small decisions to doubt this measurement question. That report declined to publicize this finding until collectively the result was a historical record that systematically excluded an entire category of evidence pointing toward truths that the guardians of knowledge were ideologically committed to denying. What makes this suppression particularly tragic is that we're not just talking about academic debates or abstract theories, but about potential knowledge of our true origins, capabilities, and cosmic context as human beings' knowledge that could transform our understanding of who we are, where we came from, and what possibilities might exist beyond the narrow materialistic framework that currently dominates Western thought. If the giants were real, if they were indeed the offspring of angels and humans, then human beings are not just evolved animals, but creatures situated in a cosmos populated by spiritual entities, with their own agendas where the material and spiritual realms intersect, where our choices and bloodlines matter in ways that extend beyond mere genetics into spiritual inheritances, and where the grand narrative of Scripture provides not just moral guidance, but an actual history of cosmic warfare between good and evil being played out through human civilizations. The bones in those burial mounds weren't just interesting fossils, but evidence of this greater reality, physical proof that the world described in ancient texts was real, that angels fell and corrupted humanity, that God intervened with a flood to cleanse the earth, that giants walked the land even after that cleansing, and that our current reality is the result of thousands of years of conflict between forces most people don't even believe exist anymore. To acknowledge the giants would be to acknowledge this entire framework, to admit that the materialistic paradigm is incomplete at best and fundamentally wrong at worst, and to open up possibilities that the secular scientific establishment has spent 2 centuries trying to close off in the name of reason and progress. But truth has a way of emerging despite suppression. And in recent years, the combination of citizen journalism, alternative media, independent researchers, and growing public skepticism toward institutional narratives has created space for the giant skeleton evidence to be reconsidered outside the constraints of academic orthodoxy. Researchers like Steve Quayle, L.A. Marzulli, and Timothy Alberino have compiled extensive documentation of giant skeleton discoveries, interviewed eyewitnesses, located old newspaper accounts, and visited sites where giants were reportedly found, building a body of evidence that, while not meeting the standards of peer-reviewed archaeology, certainly meets the standards of historical documentation that we accept for other aspects of the past. Their work has reached millions through books, documentaries, and online platforms, creating a parallel discourse where the suppressed evidence can be discussed freely and alternative interpretations considered without the gatekeeping of academic institutions that have proven themselves unwilling to engage honestly with inconvenient facts. This democratization of historical inquiry might be one of the most important developments of our current era, because it breaks the monopoly that credentialed experts held over acceptable knowledge and allows ordinary people to examine primary sources, consider evidence, and reach their own conclusions about what the past was really like, even when those conclusions challenge everything they were taught in school. The physical evidence continues to accumulate even in our own time, because excavations still occasionally turn up skeletal remains of unusual size, though they are typically explained away through medical conditions like gigantism or acromegaly, despite the frequency of such findings being far beyond what these rare conditions would predict, or they're simply not publicized beyond local news if they're reported at all. In 2004, construction workers in Greece reportedly uncovered a massive skeleton during highway excavation, with photographs circulating online showing bones of truly enormous proportions. Though skeptics quickly denounced the images as digital manipulations, and the story faded from news coverage. In 2013, a team of archaeologists claimed to have found giant skeletons in Bulgaria's Varna region, with preliminary reports suggesting heights of up to 7 feet. But follow-up information proved difficult to obtain, and the discoverers faced professional ridicule for their claims. In North America, private collectors and amateur archaeologists occasionally report finding unusually large skeletal elements during legal excavations, or from old collections being dispersed, though fear of professional consequences or government confiscation keeps many from going public with their discoveries. The pattern continues. Find something anomalous, report it, face skepticism or suppression, and watch the evidence disappear into institutional silence or internet memory holes. A process that has probably led to more evidence being deliberately concealed by finders who have learned that honesty brings only trouble, while silence allows them to keep their discoveries for private study or collection. The technology now exists to definitively settle many of these questions if there was institutional will to do so, because modern DNA analysis could examine any surviving skeletal material and determine whether these giants were simply tall humans with recognizable genetic ancestry connecting them to known populations, or whether they represent something genuinely anomalous with genetic markers that don't fit standard human haplogroups. Carbon dating could establish definitive timelines for when these individuals lived and died, potentially confirming or refuting connections to specific historical periods or events like the Biblical flood. Advanced imaging and analysis could examine bone structure, growth patterns, and pathology to determine whether the size resulted from ordinary genetic variation and developmental processes, or from something more unusual. But these analyses require access to specimens, and as we've seen, most of the giant skeletons have conveniently disappeared or locked away in institutional collections, where access is restricted or were destroyed long ago with only photographs and written descriptions surviving as evidence of their existence. The few specimens that are accessible tend to be from more recent periods and of more modest size, falling within the range that can be explained through normal variation, even if at the extreme end, while the truly enormous skeletons from the earliest excavations are precisely the ones that have been lost or become unavailable for study. A pattern that seems almost designed to prevent definitive resolution of the question one way or the other. We should also consider what it means psychologically and culturally that this question remains unresolved, that millions of people suspect a cover-up but can't prove it definitively, that the evidence exists in fragments and scattered reports, but not in the kind of concentrated, accessible form that would force institutional acknowledgement. This state of ambiguity serves certain purposes because it allows the official narrative to continue unchallenged in mainstream education and media, while also providing fuel for alternative communities who find meaning and purpose in resisting that narrative and seeking hidden truth. It creates a divide between those who trust institutional authority and those who question it, between people who need peer-reviewed confirmation before accepting claims, and those who are willing to follow evidence wherever it leads even without official blessing. In some ways, the giant skeleton mystery has become a litmus test for broader attitudes toward authority, truth-seeking, and the reliability of established knowledge, with your stance on whether the Smithsonian is hiding giant bones often correlating with your views on media honesty, government transparency, and the trustworthiness of expert consensus on everything from history to science to current events. This polarization might be unfortunate, but it's also understandable, given the documented history of institutional dishonesty on so many topics, from tobacco companies lying about cancer, to pharmaceutical companies hiding drug side effects to intelligence agencies, conducting illegal experiments on citizens. Creating an environment where skepticism toward official narratives is not paranoia, but prudent pattern recognition. The religious dimensions of this topic deserve further exploration because, for many people, the question of whether giants existed is ultimately inseparable from questions about biblical authority, the reality of the spiritual realm, and humanity's place in cosmic history, making this not just an archaeological puzzle, but a battleground in the larger culture war between secular materialism and traditional religious belief. If the giants were real, and the Smithsonian suppressed evidence of their existence, it suggests that secular institutions have been actively working to undermine biblical credibility, to prevent people from considering that Scripture might be historically accurate, and to maintain a worldview where supernatural explanations are excluded by definition rather than examined on their merits. For Christians who already believe the Bible is divinely inspired truth, the existence of giant skeleton evidence comes as no surprise, and merely confirms what Scripture has been saying all along. But for skeptics, or those raised in purely secular educational environments, discovering this evidence can be genuinely destabilizing, forcing a reconsideration of assumptions about the reliability of institutional knowledge and the plausibility of biblical claims. Some people undergo dramatic worldview shifts when they first encounter the giant skeleton evidence, moving from skepticism toward Christianity to active faith, from trust in academic authority to suspicion of official narratives, from materialistic certainty to openness toward spiritual realities, because if the institutions lied about something this significant and verifiable, what else might they be lying about? And if the Bible was right about giants when everyone said it was primitive mythology, what else might it be right about that we've been taught to dismiss? This brings us to the uncomfortable reality that truth in our current era is increasingly fractured, with different communities living in essentially separate informational universes, where different facts are acknowledged, different sources are trusted, and different narratives about reality compete without any neutral authority capable of adjudicating between them. For people who get their information primarily from mainstream academic sources, traditional media, and credentialed experts, the giant skeleton stories are fringe nonsense, long ago debunked, not worth serious consideration, and anyone who believes them is gullible or ideologically motivated. For people who've done independent research, examined primary sources, interviewed witnesses, and studied the pattern of institutional suppression across many topics, the giant skeleton evidence is compelling. The cover-up is real, and the mainstream dismissal is itself evidence of how thoroughly the guardians of official knowledge will go to protect their preferred narrative. Both groups are convinced they're following the evidence, and thinking critically, both accuse the other of bias and closed-mindedness, and the gap between them seems unbridgeable through normal discourse, because they disagree on the fundamental question of which sources and authorities deserve trust. This fractured epistemological landscape is one of the defining features of our time, and the giant skeleton controversy is just one of many topics where you can find extensive evidence on both sides, depending on where you look and whom you trust, with resolution requiring not just examining evidence, but first establishing shared standards for what counts as evidence and who has the authority to evaluate it, questions that turn out to be far more difficult than they initially appear. Perhaps the most important question is not whether giants existed or whether the Smithsonian covered it up, but rather what we're going to do with the possibility that they did. Because even if we could definitively prove tomorrow that 8 to 10 foot skeletons were found across America and were systematically suppressed by scientific institutions, that proof wouldn't automatically tell us what it means or how we should respond. Some would see it as validation of biblical truth and evidence for God's existence and intervention in history. Others might interpret it through ancient astronaut theories, seeing the giants as products of genetic manipulation by extraterrestrial visitors rather than fallen angels. Still others might view it as simply an interesting biological footnote, an extinct human variant that does not necessarily have any spiritual or cosmic significance beyond showing that human diversity in the past was greater than we currently recognize. The same evidence can support multiple interpretations depending on the larger framework you bring to it, and deciding which interpretation is correct requires making judgments about theology, metaphysics, and the nature of reality that go far beyond what physical evidence alone can determine. This is why the controversy can never be settled purely through archaeology or DNA analysis, because at its core, it's not really about bones and measurements, but about competing visions of what kind of universe we live in, whether spiritual realities exist and interact with the physical world, whether ancient texts preserve genuine historical memory or just primitive myths, and whether our current materialistic consensus represents enlightened truth, or a form of civilizational amnesia, where we've forgotten or deliberately obscured our own past. As we look at the landscape of evidence, testimony, and arguments surrounding the giant skeleton mystery, certain patterns become clear that should guide our thinking about how to approach this and similar controversies. First, the evidence for giant skeleton discoveries in historical accounts is genuinely extensive and cannot be dismissed through simple debunking or claims of mass hallucination, because we're talking about hundreds of documented reports from credible sources over many decades, with details that show consistency and specificity beyond what you'd expect from pure invention. Second, the institutional response to this evidence has been characterized by dismissal, suppression, and in many cases the literal disappearance of physical specimens, creating a legitimate basis for suspicion about motives and methods, even if you don't believe in deliberate conspiracy. Third, the topic intersects with deep cultural and religious divisions in ways that make objective evaluation difficult, because people's conclusions about giants often correlate strongly with their prior beliefs about biblical authority, institutional trustworthiness, and the nature of reality, making it hard to separate evidence, evaluation from worldview confirmation. Fourth, the question remains genuinely open in the sense that, while mainstream archaeology has reached a consensus dismissing giant skeleton claims, that consensus is based partly on the absence of specimens that disappeared under suspicious circumstances, creating a circular logic where evidence is dismissed because it's not available for study, but it's not available for study because institutions that took custody of it either lost it or refused to produce it for examination. Given these realities, perhaps the most honest position is one of informed uncertainty, acknowledging that something strange appears in the historical record regarding giant human remains in America, that the institutional handling of this evidence has been problematic at best and deliberately deceptive at worst, that the implications, if true, would be genuinely significant for our understanding of history and potentially our view of biblical reliability, but that without access to physical specimens for modern analysis, we cannot reach definitive conclusions that would satisfy skeptics who weren't present when the discoveries were made. This uncertainty is uncomfortable for people who prefer clear answers, but it may be the price we pay for living in an era where institutional authority has been compromised through documented dishonesty on numerous topics, while alternative sources of information bring their own biases and problems with verification. We're left to examine evidence as best we can, follow lines of inquiry that seem promising, remain open to surprising conclusions, while also maintaining appropriate skepticism, and accept that some questions may not be answerable to everyone. The satisfaction given the current state of available information and the barriers to accessing what additional information might exist in restricted collections or suppressed archives. The giant skeleton mystery ultimately serves as a reminder that history is not the settled known quantity we often assume it to be, but rather a contested terrain where different narratives compete, where evidence can disappear or be suppressed, where institutional interests shape what gets preserved and what gets memory hold, and where ordinary people, as observations and reports, can be systematically excluded from the official record when they don't fit preferred theories. It reminds us that the past might be stranger and more complex than textbooks acknowledge, that ancient accounts dismissed as mythology might preserve genuine historical memories, and that the line between history and legend may be far more blurred than modern scholarship admits. Whether or not you conclude that the Nephilim walked in ancient America, the investigation of that possibility opens up larger questions about how we know what we know about the past, who decides which evidence is credible, and which is not, and whether our current historical paradigm serves to illuminate truth or to maintain a particular worldview that serves the interests of those who control the institutions of knowledge, production, and distribution. These are questions worth asking regardless of where the giant bones might be today, because the search for them has already revealed truths about institutional behavior, media narratives, and the contested nature of historical knowledge that remain relevant whether the giants themselves were 8 feet tall or just products of misidentification and exaggeration, grown larger in the retelling.